For nearly 3 decades, one unanswered question has continued to divide investigators, forensic experts, and the public alike. It is not a hidden confession. It is not a newly discovered witness. It is a single unknown male DNA profile recovered during one of America's most discussed homicide investigations. Official forensic testing confirmed that this profile did not match JonBenét Ramsey, and over the years, law enforcement records repeatedly acknowledged that its significance remained under investigation. But one mystery has never gone away. Who left it behind? That question changed the direction of the case more than once. Investigative files, laboratory reports, and later public statements all point to the same reality. The DNA exists, yet no one has been able to conclusively explain how it got there. Some investigators have treated it as potentially critical evidence. Others have urged caution, noting that forensic science cannot automatically prove when, where, or how DNA was deposited. That single disagreement has shaped the investigation for years. The deeper I examined the official records, the more surprising the contradictions became. Advances in DNA technology brought renewed hope, while new reviews of forensic evidence raised fresh questions instead of clear answers. Public statements, investigative updates, and expert analyses often seem to move in different directions. Rather than narrowing the mystery, every new development appeared to open another layer that demanded closer examination. In my view, the most remarkable part of this case is not simply that an unknown DNA profile was found. It is that, after nearly 30 years of scientific advances and repeated investigative reviews, its true source has still not been conclusively identified through publicly confirmed evidence. To understand why the single DNA profile continues to divide investigators today, we first need to examine exactly what was found and what the official forensic evidence actually says. The DNA that changed everything. Why has one tiny DNA sample become the biggest mystery in the entire JonBenét Ramsey investigation? As I began examining the official case records, forensic reports, and public statements released over the years, one detail appeared again and again. It was not a fingerprint. It was not a witness statement. It was not even a piece of physical evidence that could be seen with the naked eye. It was an unknown male DNA profile, a forensic finding that has continued to shape this investigation for decades. From the beginning, investigators understood that DNA evidence had the potential to answer questions that traditional detective work could not. But this particular profile did something unusual. Instead of narrowing the investigation, it expanded it. Every new forensic review brought renewed attention to the same unanswered question. If this DNA belonged to the person responsible for crime, it could completely change the direction of the investigation. If it came from another source, then investigators were following a mystery with no direct connection to the crime at all. That uncertainty is exactly what has kept this evidence at the center of the case. According to publicly released forensic information, laboratory testing identified a DNA profile from an unknown male that did not match JonBenét Ramsey. Over time, additional forensic testing and later DNA analysis continued to examine whether this profile remained consistent across the evidence. Publicly available records also show that this profile was entered into the national DNA database used by law enforcement in the United States. Yet year after year, no confirmed identification has been publicly announced. That single fact created one of the most unusual situations in modern criminal investigations. Normally, DNA evidence is viewed as one of the strongest investigative tools available. It has solved thousands of cold cases and identified suspects decades after crimes were committed. But this case refused to follow that pattern. Instead of producing clear answers, every scientific advance seemed to create another layer of uncertainty. As I compared official investigative updates with later public statements, another twist became impossible to ignore. Different officials emphasized different parts of the same evidence. Some public statements highlighted the importance of the unknown male DNA and suggested that it could point investigators toward the person responsible. Other experts urged caution, explaining that DNA must always be interpreted within the complete context of the crime scene. A DNA profile alone cannot automatically explain when it was deposited, how it arrived there, or whether it is directly connected to crime itself. That distinction is often overlooked during public discussions, but inside forensic investigations, it is critical. Then another unexpected development changed the conversation once again. As DNA technology improved over the years, many people expected the mystery to disappear. More sensitive testing methods had already helped solve numerous cold cases across the country. Naturally, attention returned to the JonBenét investigation. If modern science had become so powerful, why had this profile still not produced a publicly identified individual? That question remains one of the strongest unresolved points in the entire investigation. If investigators already had this DNA, why is the case still unsolved? The answer is more complicated than many headlines suggest. According to forensic experts and official reviews, obtaining a DNA profile is only one step in a criminal investigation. Investigators must also determine its source, establish its relevance, rule out innocent explanations, and connect it with other verified evidence. Without those links, even important forensic findings cannot automatically identify the person responsible. This is where the investigation became even more complex. Several official reviews, independent examinations, and later investigative discussions continue to revisit the DNA evidence. Rather than removing uncertainty, these reviews often highlighted just how carefully forensic evidence must be interpreted. The existence of an unidentified DNA profile remained undisputed, but its exact significance continued to be debated among investigators and forensic specialists. In my view, this is one reason the case continues to capture worldwide attention. The mystery is not simply about discovering whose DNA it is. The deeper mystery is understanding whether that profile represents the key to solving the case, or whether investigators have spent years trying to interpret evidence whose role has never been fully established through publicly confirmed findings. That distinction changes everything. Every time the investigation appeared to move closer to an answer, another unanswered forensic question emerged. Every technological improvement created fresh hope, yet the central mystery remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. The unknown male DNA was never forgotten because every official review returned to the same unresolved issue. Its owner has still not been publicly identified through confirmed law enforcement findings. But perhaps the biggest surprise is that the mystery does not begin with the DNA profile itself. It begins with its location. Because before anyone can understand what this unknown DNA may actually mean, one crucial question must be answered first. So where exactly was this DNA found? That answer opens an entirely new chapter of the investigation, and it changes the way many people have understood this evidence for years. Where was the DNA found? Where did this unknown DNA come from? That question has followed investigators for decades. But before asking who the DNA belongs to, I believe there is a more important place to begin. We first need to understand exactly where it was found. Because in forensic investigations, the location of DNA can be just as important as the DNA itself. Finding DNA on clothing is not unusual. Modern forensic science has shown that clothing can collect DNA through direct contact, indirect contact, manufacturing, packaging, or everyday handling. Yet investigators believe the location of this particular DNA deserved much closer attention. It was not simply another laboratory finding. According to publicly released forensic reports and later investigative summaries, it became one of the most closely examined pieces of evidence in the entire case. The first major location was JonBenét Ramsey's underwear. Laboratory testing identified an unknown male DNA profile from biological material recovered from the underwear. That finding immediately attracted attention because investigators needed to determine whether the DNA was directly connected to crime or whether there could be another explanation. Official records confirmed that the DNA profile did not match JonBenét Ramsey and remained unidentified through publicly confirmed law enforcement findings. At first glance, that discovery appeared straightforward. But the deeper I examined the official records, the more complicated the picture became. Years later, additional forensic testing focused on another piece of clothing, the long johns JonBenét was wearing. According to publicly reported forensic testing, DNA consistent with the same unknown male profile was detected on portions of the long johns. That development immediately raised new questions. Investigators were no longer looking at a single location. They were examining whether similar genetic material appeared on more than one garment associated with the victim. That was a significant moment in the investigation, not because it answered the mystery, but because it expanded it. Some investigators and prosecutors publicly pointed to these findings as evidence deserving continued investigation. Others cautioned that forensic science requires careful interpretation. DNA found on clothing does not automatically establish when it arrived how it was transferred, or whether it was deposited during the commission of the crime. Those are separate scientific questions, and official reviews repeatedly emphasize the importance of evaluating all available evidence together rather than relying on DNA alone. That distinction changed the discussion surrounding the case. As I reviewed laboratory summaries and public investigative statements, another detail stood out. The public often focus on the phrase unknown DNA, but investigators focus on context. Every forensic finding had to be compared with the physical evidence, documented crime scene observations, witness statements, timelines, and laboratory procedures. A DNA profile, no matter how important, could never be interpreted in isolation. Then another twist emerged. Over the years, additional items connected to the investigation underwent forensic examination. Public records confirmed that multiple pieces of evidence from a crime scene were tested using available forensic methods. However, not every tested item produced the same investigative value, and officials have not publicly stated that every location yielded the same unknown male profile. That is an important distinction because speculation is often expanded beyond what official forensic reports actually confirm. In my view, this is where many discussions about the case become confusing. The verified evidence is already compelling enough without adding assumptions. The confirmed findings tell us an unidentified male DNA profile was recovered from the underwear, and later testing reported consistent findings on the long johns. Beyond that, investigators continued evaluating the significance of those results alongside every other piece of evidence collected during the investigation. But one question refused to disappear. Could the location of this DNA tell investigators whether it belonged to the person responsible? For years, forensic experts, investigators, and legal analysts examined exactly that possibility. Some argued that the locations increase the potential investigative importance of the DNA. Others emphasize that DNA transfer is scientifically complex and that location alone cannot establish how or when genetic material was deposited. Public statements from investigators over the years reflect this continuing debate rather than a single accepted conclusion. That ongoing disagreement may be one reason the case has remained unresolved despite remarkable advances in forensic science. Every new review seemed to strengthen one possibility while introducing another unanswered question. Instead of closing the investigation, each layer of forensic analysis revealed just how much still remained uncertain. The evidence locations were carefully documented. The laboratory findings were repeatedly reviewed. The unknown male profile remained part of the investigation. Yet, one critical question still had not been answered through publicly confirmed evidence. Because discovering where DNA was found is only the beginning, the next question may be even more important. What kind of DNA was it? And could that answer completely change the way this evidence has been understood for nearly 3 decades? What does this DNA actually mean? Does finding DNA automatically solve a murder? It sounds like it should. Modern investigations have solved countless cold cases because of DNA evidence. In many cases, one genetic profile has been enough to identify a suspect years, or even decades, later. But as I examined the official records and forensic findings in the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, one fact became impossible to ignore. DNA is one of the strongest tools in criminal investigations, but it is not a shortcut to the truth. Everything begins with a DNA profile. A DNA profile is not a person's photograph or name. It is a series of genetic markers that investigators compare against known samples or law enforcement databases. In this case, forensic testing identified an unknown male DNA profile that did not match JonBenét Ramsey. That profile was considered significant enough to remain part of the investigation and was later entered into the national DNA database used by law enforcement. Yet despite years of comparison, no publicly confirmed match has been announced. At first, that sounds surprising, but a DNA profile can only identify someone if there is a matching reference sample. Without a match, investigators know that an unknown person exists, but not who that person is. The science behind those comparisons is based largely on short tandem repeats, commonly called STRs. These are small sections of DNA that vary from person to person. By comparing enough STR markers, forensic scientists can determine whether 2 DNA samples are consistent with the same individual. This method has become one of the most trusted tools in forensic science and has been used worldwide in criminal investigations. However, even reliable science has limits. A strong DNA profile does not explain how the DNA arrived at a particular location. It cannot reveal the exact time it was deposited. It cannot describe the events that placed it there. Those questions must be answered by combining forensic science with crime scene evidence, witness statements, investigative timelines, and official reports. That is where this case became far more complicated than many people realize. As I continued reviewing the publicly available forensic information, another important concept appeared repeatedly: mixed DNA. Mixed DNA simply means that genetic material from more than one person may be present in the same sample. That is not unusual in forensic investigations, especially when clothing or frequently handled objects are examined. Scientists must separate those genetic signals as accurately as possible before determining whether an unknown profile can be identified. This process requires careful interpretation, and the results must always be evaluated alongside the rest of the evidence. Then another layer of complexity entered the discussion. Many people have heard the phrase touch DNA. Touch DNA refers to tiny amounts of genetic material that can sometimes be transferred through normal contact, such as handling an object or clothing. While touch DNA has become an important forensic tool in many investigations, experts also recognize that DNA transfer can occur in different ways. Because of that, forensic scientists are careful not to assume that every DNA finding directly identifies the person responsible for a crime without supporting evidence. That point has become especially important in discussions surrounding this case. Public debate is often focused on whether the unknown male DNA represents direct evidence or whether another explanation remains scientifically possible. Official investigative reviews have acknowledged the importance of continued forensic analysis, while also recognizing that DNA evidence must be interpreted within the complete context of the investigation. Then another unexpected detail deserves attention. Not every DNA profile is equally complete. Sometimes investigators recover a full DNA profile with enough genetic markers to make highly reliable comparisons. In other situations, only a partial profile is available because the DNA sample is extremely small or has degraded over time. Partial profiles can still provide valuable investigative leads, but they generally offer fewer comparison points than complete profiles and may require additional testing or supporting evidence. That distinction helps explain why some investigations move quickly while others remain unresolved for years. How much can investigators actually learn from this DNA? The answer is both impressive and limited. DNA can exclude individuals, compare biological samples, and potentially identify an unknown person if a matching reference sample exists. But DNA alone cannot reconstruct an entire crime. It cannot independently establish motive, sequence of events, or the identity of the person responsible without support from other verified evidence. That is why investigators continue reviewing forensic findings alongside physical evidence, documented witness statements, laboratory reports, and official investigative records. In my view, this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the entire case. Many people expect DNA to provide immediate certainty because television often presents forensic science that way. Real investigations are different. The science can answer powerful questions, but only when every piece of evidence supports the same conclusion. That brings us to another mystery that has continued to divide experienced investigators and forensic specialists for years. If the DNA represents genuine forensic evidence, why have respected experts reached different conclusions about what it actually means? The answer does not lie in the laboratory alone. It lies in how the same scientific evidence has been interpreted, and that disagreement may be one of the most important turning points in the entire investigation. The biggest debate. Could the most important clue in the entire investigation actually be misleading investigators? After studying the official records, forensic reports, public statements, and later investigative reviews, I realized something unexpected. The greatest mystery is no longer whether the unknown male DNA exists. That has been publicly documented for years. The real mystery is what that DNA actually represents. And that single question has divided experienced investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and independent experts for decades. What makes this debate so unusual is that each side relies on real forensic principles rather than speculation. They are looking at the same laboratory findings, yet reaching different conclusions. That is why this discussion remains one of the most important and most carefully examine parts of the entire case. The first position is the one that receives the most public attention. According to this view, the unknown male DNA may belong to the person responsible for the crime. Supporters point to the fact that an unidentified male DNA profile was documented through forensic testing, later entered into the National Law Enforcement DNA Database, and has never been publicly matched to a known individual. They also note that similar genetic findings were reported on more than one item of clothing, making the evidence worthy of continued investigation. Some former investigators and prosecutors have publicly described the DNA as an important lead that should remain central to the case. They argue that if future DNA technology or expanded databases identify the source of that profile, it could provide investigators with a critical breakthrough. At first, that theory appears persuasive, but then another equally important question emerges. If the DNA truly identifies the person responsible, why has decades of investigation, repeated forensic review, and continued scientific advancement not produced a publicly confirmed identification? That unanswered question leads directly to the second major position. Some forensic experts have cautioned that the DNA could have reached the clothing through contamination or other innocent mechanisms unrelated to the crime. It is important to understand what contamination means in forensic science. It does not necessarily imply negligence or misconduct. Contamination can refer to unintended DNA transfer before, during, or after manufacturing, packaging, handling, collection, or laboratory processing. Modern forensic science recognizes these possibilities and evaluates them carefully in every investigation. This theory gained attention because later scientific research demonstrated that extremely small amounts of DNA can sometimes be transferred without direct involvement in a crime. As forensic testing became more sensitive, investigators also became more cautious about interpreting trace DNA. However, there is another twist. No publicly released official report has conclusively determined that the unknown male DNA in this case resulted from contamination. Likewise, no official report has conclusively established that contamination has been ruled out. Instead, the available records show that investigators continued evaluating both possibilities while keeping the DNA under review. That uncertainty has remained remarkably consistent over the years. Then there is a third position, one that is often discussed by forensic scientists because it reflects how DNA behaves in the real world. This explanation focuses on unknown transfer. DNA can sometimes move from one person to another through intermediate contact, a process known as secondary transfer. Scientific studies have demonstrated that under certain conditions, DNA may be transferred indirectly through objects, clothing, or human contact. Whether that occurred in this case remains unproven, but forensic experts acknowledge that the possibility must be considered whenever trace DNA evidence is interpreted. This theory does not argue that the DNA is unimportant. Instead, it argues that identifying the source of DNA and understanding how it arrived at a location are two different scientific questions. One cannot automatically answer the other. As I reviewed official investigative statements alongside forensic discussions, one pattern became increasingly clear. The disagreement is not about whether the laboratory detected an unknown male DNA profile. The disagreement centers on what investigators can reliably conclude from that discovery. Why are experts still arguing about the same DNA decades later? Because every interpretation must satisfy all the available evidence, not just one laboratory result. Any explanation must fit the documented forensic findings, the physical evidence recovered during the investigation, witness statements, investigative timelines, and every verified fact established through official records. If one theory explains the DNA but conflicts with other confirmed evidence, investigators cannot simply accept it. That careful process is what makes criminal investigations slower than public opinion often expects. In my view, this is exactly why the debate has lasted for so many years. Each position answers certain questions, while leaving others unresolved. The DNA remains significant. The science remains valid. Yet the complete story behind that DNA has never been publicly established through confirmed evidence. Every new advance in forensic technology has renewed hope. Every new review has prompted investigators to look again. And every time the discussion seems close to reaching a conclusion, another unanswered question appears. That may be the greatest twist of all. The strongest piece of forensic evidence in the case is also the one whose meaning remains the most fiercely debated. But the unknown male DNA is not the result of contamination or an unrelated transfer. Then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Who does that DNA actually belong to? That question leads directly to the next stage of the investigation, where detectives, forensic science, and modern DNA technology begin searching for a name behind the profile. Who doesn't match? Who has already been ruled out? After following the unknown male DNA through laboratory reports, investigative updates, and years of public discussion, I reached another important question. Solving a DNA mystery is not only about finding a match. Sometimes, the investigation moves forward by discovering who does not match. In this case, that process has quietly shaped the investigation for decades. According to publicly available law enforcement statements and forensic reporting, the unknown male DNA profile recovered during the investigation has been compared against numerous known individuals over the years. Those comparisons were not random. Detectives collected reference samples from people they believed should be evaluated based on the investigation. Each comparison had one purpose: to determine whether anyone already connected to the case matched the unknown profile. But the result remained remarkably consistent. No publicly confirmed investigation has announced that the unknown male DNA belongs to any known individual connected to the case. Instead, investigators continued searching while eliminating possibilities one by one. Every exclusion narrowed one path, yet the central mystery remained exactly the same. One of the most widely discussed developments involved members of the Ramsey family. Publicly released information has repeatedly stated that DNA testing did not identify the unknown male profile as belonging to JonBenét Ramsey. In addition, investigators obtained reference DNA from immediate family members during the investigation. Over the years, official statements and public reporting have indicated that those comparisons did not produce a publicly confirmed match to the unidentified male profile. That finding immediately changed the direction of the investigation. It did not solve the case. It simply meant investigators had to continue looking elsewhere. As I examined later investigative updates, another important detail emerged. Detectives did not stop after comparing family reference samples. Public reporting indicates that additional individuals associated with the investigation were also asked to provide DNA samples during different stages of the case. Those comparisons form part of the normal investigative process, helping detectives eliminate possibilities rather than relying on assumptions. Every exclusion removed one potential explanation, but every exclusion also made the remaining mystery more difficult. Then another important forensic tool entered the investigation: CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, is a national DNA database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Investigators enter the unknown male DNA profile into this system so it could be compared against DNA profiles already stored in the database. If a matching profile existed within CODIS, investigators could receive an investigative lead. For many observers, this seemed like the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. But that breakthrough never publicly arrived. According to publicly available information, the unknown male DNA profile has not produced a publicly confirmed CODIS match. That single fact has remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the investigation. Every year that passes without a confirmed match raises another possibility. Either the person connected to that DNA has never entered the database, the available profile cannot yet identify a specific individual through current records, or the DNA source is another explanation that investigators have not publicly confirmed. Each possibility carries different investigative consequences, and none of them provides a complete answer. If all these people were excluded, who's left? That question becomes more difficult with every passing year. Investigators cannot simply assume that every unidentified DNA profile belongs to an unknown offender. At the same time, they also cannot ignore a profile that has remained unexplained despite repeated forensic review. This balance between caution and persistence has defined the investigation from the beginning. As I reviewed official investigative statements, one pattern became clear. Detectives have consistently avoided declaring the DNA mystery solved without evidence that could withstand forensic scrutiny. Instead, they have continued evaluating new technology, reviewing existing evidence, and comparing every new lead against a documented forensic record. In my view, that careful approach explains why this case continues to attract attention from investigators and forensic experts around the world. The list of publicly excluded individuals has grown over time, yet the identity behind the unknown male DNA has remained just beyond reach. The investigation has removed many possibilities, but it has not reached a publicly confirmed conclusion. That is a rare position for any long-running investigation. Usually, repeated exclusions gradually point toward one remaining answer. Hey, the exclusions have created an even larger mystery. The unknown profile remains unidentified. The database has not produced a publicly confirmed match. The investigation continues to revisit the same forensic evidence with every advance in DNA science. And that leads to perhaps the most important question of all. If traditional DNA comparisons have not revealed the identity behind this profile, could modern forensic technology finally succeed where earlier methods could not? That possibility has become the next major chapter in the search for answers, and it may depend on scientific tools that did not exist when this investigation first began. Can new DNA technology solve it? Could today's technology finally identify the unknown male? For years, that question seemed impossible to answer. Every available DNA comparison had been performed. The unknown male profile had been entered into law enforcement databases. Investigators continued reviewing evidence, yet no publicly confirmed identification emerged. Then forensic science began changing faster than almost anyone expected. Technologies that did not exist when this investigation began are now helping detectives solve cases that have remained unsolved for decades. As I examined recent developments in forensic science, one pattern stood out. Modern DNA investigations no longer rely only on finding an exact match inside a law enforcement database. Today, investigators have additional tools capable of generating entirely new investigative leads. Those advances have transformed the way many cold cases are approached, giving renewed hope to investigations once believed to have reached a dead end. One of the most significant developments is forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, forensic genetic genealogy does not begin by looking for the exact individual. Instead, when legally authorized and supported by a suitable DNA sample, investigators compare a DNA profile against participating genealogy databases to identify possible biological relatives. Those family connections can help investigators build family trees, gradually narrowing the search toward an unknown person. It is a method that has changed modern forensic investigations in remarkable ways. The important point is that genetic genealogy does not automatically identify a suspect. It creates investigative leads that must be verified through additional evidence, traditional detective work, and confirmed DNA comparisons before investigators can reach reliable conclusions. That distinction is what makes this technology so powerful and so carefully regulated. As I continued reviewing how these methods have been used, another twist became clear. Several high-profile cold cases that remained unsolved for decades have eventually been resolved after investigators combined preserved DNA evidence with modern genealogy techniques and updated laboratory analysis. In many of those investigations, the DNA had existed for years. The breakthrough came not because the evidence changed, but because the technology used to analyze it became far more advanced. That realization changes the way many people view the JonBenét Ramsey investigation. The unknown DNA profile has been discussed for years, but the scientific tools available to study that profile continue to improve. Methods for recovering smaller DNA samples, generating more complete profiles, and interpreting complex mixtures have advanced significantly since the late 1990s. Every improvement gives investigators another opportunity to re-examine evidence that may once have been considered too limited for further analysis. Then another important development deserves attention. In recent years, officials connected to the investigation have publicly acknowledged continuing interest in modern DNA testing. Public statements from the Boulder Police Department have indicated that evidence remains under review as forensic technology evolves, and authorities have stated that they remain open to using appropriate new scientific methods when feasible. Those statements do not promise a solution, but they confirm that the investigation has not ignored advances in forensic science. That alone represents an important shift. Instead of treating the evidence as complete, investigators continue asking whether today's science can answer questions that yesterday's science could not. Why wasn't this possible 20 years ago? Because forensic technology has evolved dramatically. Earlier DNA testing often required larger biological samples and had fewer analytical options than laboratories possess today. Modern techniques can sometimes recover useful information from evidence that previously produced limited results. Sophisticated software, improved laboratory procedures, and enhanced sequencing methods have expanded what forensic scientists may be able to learn from preserved evidence, depending on its condition. However, even these advances come with important limitations. Every new technology depends on the quality and quantity of the original DNA. If the biological material is too limited, degraded, or unsuitable for certain testing methods, even the most advanced laboratories may face significant challenges. Science has become more capable, but it has not become unlimited. In my view, that balance between hope and scientific caution is what makes the stage of the investigation so compelling. The case is no longer defined only by what investigators could do in 1996. It is increasingly defined by what forensic science may be able to accomplish in the future. Yet every genuine advance also reminds us that technology can only answer questions supported by the available evidence. That creates one final twist. Suppose modern forensic technology eventually identifies the person connected to the unknown DNA profile. Would that discovery alone resolve the investigation? Not necessarily. Investigators would still need to determine how the DNA was deposited, whether it is directly connected to crime, and how that finding fits alongside every other verified piece of physical evidence, documented witness statement, and official investigative record. Identifying a DNA owner would be a major investigative development, but it would still represent one piece of a much larger puzzle. And that leads directly to the next chapter. Because the greatest mystery may not be whether science can identify the unknown DNA. It may be whether identifying that person would finally answer the question that has remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. The final question: is this unknown DNA the key to solving the JonBenét Ramsey case? Or is it the very reason the case remains unsolved? After examining the forensic reports, official investigative statements, laboratory findings, and decades of public records, I found myself returning to the same unanswered question again and again. Not because investigators ignored the evidence, not because science failed to advance, but because one unidentified DNA profile has continued to resist every attempt to explain it with complete certainty. That is what makes this evidence so different. Most forensic mysteries become smaller over time as new technology eliminates possibilities. This one has done the opposite. Every scientific advance has revealed another layer of the same question. The unknown male DNA has remained part of the investigation, yet its exact significance has never been publicly established through confirmed law enforcement findings. That contradiction has defined the case for nearly 3 decades. Throughout this investigation, one fact has remained remarkably consistent. The unknown male DNA profile exists. It has been examined repeatedly. It has been compared against known reference samples. It has been entered into the national DNA database used by law enforcement. Publicly confirmed records have not identified its source. Those are not theories. They are the documented foundation of the mystery. Everything beyond those facts becomes far more complicated. Some investigators have publicly described the DNA as an important lead that deserves continued attention. Other forensic experts have urged caution, emphasizing that DNA evidence must always be interpreted alongside the complete investigative record. Neither position dismisses the science. Instead, both acknowledge the same reality. Identifying DNA and understanding its role are not necessarily the same thing. That distinction may be the single most important lesson this investigation has offered. As I reviewed the evidence, another unexpected pattern emerged. The case has never depended on one unanswered question alone. It depends on several unanswered questions that are connected to one another. Who contributed the unknown DNA? When was it deposited? How did it reach the clothing? Does it have a direct connection to the crime? Or is there another scientifically supported explanation? Each answer changes the meaning of the next question. That is why the investigation continues to resist simple conclusions. What is the one question investigators still cannot answer? Not whose DNA it is. The deeper question is whether that unidentified DNA represents the person responsible for the crime, or whether it reflects something else that investigators have not yet fully explained through publicly confirmed evidence. Until that question is answered, every theory remains incomplete, regardless of how convincing it may initially appear. That realization changes the entire investigation. For years, Public discussion has often focused on finding a name, but experienced investigators know that a name alone is not enough. Criminal investigations require context, corroboration, and evidence that fits together without contradiction. One forensic discovery must support the documented timeline, the physical evidence, witness statements, laboratory findings, and every verified investigative fact. That standard has never changed. In my view, this is exactly why the JonBenét Ramsey investigation continues to draw attention from forensic professionals around the world. It is not simply because an unknown DNA profile exists. It is because this profile has survived decades of scientific review without producing a publicly confirmed explanation that fully resolves the questions surrounding it. Few investigations remain balanced on a single unresolved forensic issue for this long. Then one final possibility remains. Modern forensic science continues to evolve. Investigators have publicly stated that they remain willing to consider appropriate advances in DNA technology as they become available. Every improvement creates another opportunity to re-examine preserved evidence using methods that did not exist when this investigation began. Whether those advances will ultimately answer the mystery remains unknown. But if this DNA is finally identified tomorrow, what would it really change? It could identify the source of the DNA. It could eliminate long-standing uncertainty surrounding one crucial piece of evidence. It could open entirely new investigative leads, or it could simply answer one question while leaving several others unresolved. Until investigators determine how that DNA fits within the complete body of verified evidence, no single laboratory result can, by itself, explain the entire case. And perhaps that is the most enduring mystery of all. For nearly 3 decades, investigators have searched for the owner of one unknown DNA profile. The day that mystery is finally answered may not mark the end of the investigation. It may simply begin the final search for the truth.